I have just a basic adage, and that is that the best thing to do in any given situation is to make the right decision. The second best thing to do is to make a bad decision. The worst thing to do is make no decision. So I've lived my life that way, and I've made a ton of bad decisions, but it never really bothered me because it was like, I can't stop myself from making a decision, because that is a world you just don't want to get into, the world of passivity and being locked up. And so what happened, though, is this is what I learned concerning this trap, is that I would make a decision and then I would immediately question whether it was a good decision or a bad decision. And I just didn't know. And so then I would worry more about the decision I made, which increased my anxiety about the situation that I was already in. And it magnified the trap, and it started to lock me up. You just start to get into, I don't want to make any decisions. I don't want to do anything. I just want to survive the day. And it was just so odd that I started to get locked up. And the only reason I was able to recognize that this. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. Its only purpose is to coach you up in your faith. That's why I do what I do. It's not for me, it's for you. We are not here to tell you what to think, but focus on how you think. And the reason why is because it's how we think about things that often makes the biggest difference in our lives. We focus on critical thinking skills. What are they? How do they work? And how do you apply them to your everyday life? Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says this: "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." And that's what we really want to do, is we want to get out of the pattern of thinking that the world has imposed upon us. And so we don't want to be conformed to that way of thinking. And the way you do that is you have new ways of thinking. That means transformed by renewing your mind. I need to renew it so that it's not just what I'm thinking, but how I am thinking that makes a huge difference. And when I learn those skills, that's how I know what the will of God is. That's what I know what good is. That's what I know what acceptable is. That's what I know is perfect. Now, I will never obtain to perfection. I'll never be perfectly good. But what's interesting is that the more I think in a way that God has designed me to think with critical thinking skills, then the more you can see what God is not only doing in the world, but what he wants to do in me. And so it's a very important process of being coached up in your faith. And so that's why we are here. And coaching you in this way to think is going to give you clarity about your life. It tells you when you get these new critical thinking skills and your mind is renewed and you're understanding what's good and perfect and acceptable according to the will of God, then what happens, I start to see where I am going in this life. I start to see my purpose. My core values become clear and strong and firm. I start to know not only what I believe, but I also have conviction, which is critically important in life, and that is, I know why I believe it. So it's not just that I believe something, but I also know why and why it is true. So in the end, it's very important for you to understand when you listen to the Salty Pastor Podcast, it doesn't matter what I think. It really doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what you think, because it's your faith. And that's what we want to coach you up in. So with that in mind, let's jump into this week's topic of choice, and that is the issue of courage in the face of fear. Now, a brief reminder of what we talked about on Tuesday and our Bible study. We looked at the event in the Gospel of Matthew where the disciples are caught out on the Sea of Galilee, which is a big, big lake, and they aren't able to reach the shore. And Jesus had sent them ahead. And then in the middle of the night, early morning, he is walking across the lake. and they're scared to death because they think they're seeing a ghost. Jesus says, nope, it's the real deal. This is me. He said, don't be afraid. And then Peter, of course, says, Lord, call to me. And he steps out of the boat and he starts to walk, but then he gets distracted by the waves and the water. It's like, I can't believe I'm doing this. He starts to think, and Jesus then grabs a hold of him, lifts him back up. They get back into the boat, and he says, "O ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" So that was kind of the passage of scripture that we looked at. And the biblical principles that we discovered in our study of that passage were following. Number one, every person, no matter how connected you are to Jesus, how strong you are, how self-confident you are, how deep and mature your faith is, you're going to have times when you face fear in your life. And you're going to have fear in ways you never imagined. Number two, in those moments, you have to choose courage. You have to grab a hold of courage. You have to step into courage. And how you choose, how you step, how you grab a hold of courage makes all the difference between being courageous or being reckless, between being courageous or passive, right? Or cowardly. So that's really the key thing that we studied on Tuesday in our Bible study. And that has to do with, how do I step into courage in the midst of fear? Now, what I'd like you to do now as we move on is I want you to watch it's about a 2-minute video from Jocko Willink about facing your fear. Okay, let's watch.
You know, I actually took this question from Twitter and I answered the question in one word. You've lived a life dominated by doubt and fear. How do you step into bravery? Step. That's how you step into bravery. Step. Take the step. Step aggressively towards your fear. And that step towards your fear is the step into bravery. Because we're scared of what we don't know. And there is only one way to learn and to know, and that is to confront that fear. You have to step, you have to go. And this simple action, this simple attitude, it answers so many questions. So many questions. How do you get to the gym every day? You step. You go. How do you change your diet? You step. You go. How do you overcome fear of failure or fear of success or fear of fear itself? You step.
Now, that's really interesting how he said you have to step, and that's very similar to what Peter did. He just took a step. And so I kind of want to focus on that right now. And that is, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how successful you are, how accomplished you are, how many parts of your life plan are coming together, how many things you've checked off your bucket list, no matter how mature and wise and experienced you become, there is going to come a point in your life where you're going to experience a season of great fear. Now, I don't mean a adrenaline-fueled reaction to an immediately catalytic traumatic event, right? Like, an accident or something like that. Boy, those things create an inordinate amount of fear very quickly. What I'm talking about is a season of fear. And you're not going to know when it comes, and it's going to come at you in a way you never imagined. Believe me, I'm speaking from experience. You're going to feel absolutely overwhelmed in this particular area. You're going to get locked up and you're not going to know what to do. You're going to feel like whatever you do, when you try to do something or navigate your way out of it is a step backwards, and it just makes things worse. And this is what pushes your heart and your soul to what the Bible calls despair. In the Psalms, King David described it this way. He said, I am surrounded on all sides by those who seek my destruction. He says in another place, he goes, my enemies triumph over me. You read a lot of the Psalms and you just get this notion that David had experienced these seasons of fear, and he writes songs about them, and he cries out to God in the midst of his fear. And I think those Psalms show us how David was taking a step in order to face his fear and overcome it. Now, when you find yourself in that moment that you are experiencing a season of fear, how do you choose courage? I mean, we talked earlier about it's how you grab a hold or step into or choose courage. How do you do that? Well, the first thing I think you have to do is beware of the trap of fear when you're in a season of fear. Now, one of the things that I've discovered just in the last few years of my life is how often I have fallen into the trap of fear and I didn't know it. The biggest one has happened, just in the last few years of my life. Some of you may know, maybe not all of you, if you're a new listener, is that my wife was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of MS. And she also has one of the rarest manifestations or symptoms of MS. And what these are neuropathic or nerve seizures. These seizures come over her. They're extremely painful. They completely debilitate her. Sometimes they're 45 minutes long. Sometimes they're 2 hours long. And it's just heartbreaking. And it's so sad. We've been to the Mayo Clinic twice. We've been to specialists in Salt Lake City. And I go on and on. I don't want to inundate you with all this information. The bottom line is that there's really no cure for this. And so we're trying to do the best we can to manage it. Now, I spent my life preparing myself to deal with attacks of fear from the outside of my family. As a pastor, I'm often criticized. I'm criticized sometimes legitimately and sometimes illegitimately. And over time, you just have to realize is that when you're in a leadership role, you're going to have to pay what is commonly called the cost of leadership. And that is at any given moment, somebody's not happy with you and they're more than willing to let you know it. And so, but over time, I've just really learned how to deal with those attacks. They never rattled me. They never really affected me for a long period of time. And I realize now, looking back in the last couple of years, it's because these things were always outside of my family. These things I expected to happen because I was standing up and pushing back against the kingdom of Satan, right? And I was pushing forward the kingdom of God. And so I should expect to suffer for that. I should expect, right, to be criticized for that, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly. And so I had prepared myself for that, and it had never really affected me and through my entire ministry. I never entered into a season of fear, but this time I entered into a season of fear, and I wasn't prepared for it. And what I discovered is a lot of things about a season of fear. First and foremost is you feel overwhelmed. You're like, oh, we have the greatest medical technology in the world, and there's an answer out there. And so you start pursuing every answer you can. You're looking at every option, and you're listening to everybody, and nothing happens. The other thing too that created a season of fear for me, for my wife, was that no matter how hard I tried, there was nothing I could do that could make any difference in her suffering. And that is really difficult for me. And so it just created a season of fear. I felt completely overwhelmed. And so I can't say that I'm out of that season yet. I can't say I've conquered it, but I have learned a few things about how this trap works and what it's done to me. The first one is this, is when you're in a season of fear, the first thing happens is you start to worry and have anxiety, right? Your sense of, I don't know what to do. I can't seem to get out of this. And so you just have a worry or anxiety that crops up. And the first thing that happens to you when you start to worry or you have anxiety is you can't sleep. Right? You have sleepless nights. And one of the things that happened in our life is that my wife is on, certain medications that have to be taken at certain times. And so waking up at 3 a.m. all the time to do that. And then these things happen. I don't want to get too deep into it. Just to let you know is that I started operating on, 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. And this is part of the trap, is because the more sleep you miss, I discovered the more emotionally unstable I became, right? I mean, I just had real difficulty controlling my emotions. And the more unstable emotionally I became, the more bad decisions I made, right? And I'm not saying, like massively bad things, like I, took all of our savings and bought a bad stock kind of a thing, bet the farm in Vegas. But what I'm just saying is that you start making bad decisions, just even in everyday things. Like you get in your car and you're driving to the store and you don't remember why you're going. You make bad decisions and how you have conversations with your wife or with my kids or with friends. I make bad decisions and not, making sure that I was getting enough sleep. You just keep making bad decisions and these things kind of cascade in on you. And here's the most insightful thing that I realized is that I've always felt about myself that, I have just a basic adage, and that is that the best thing to do in any given situation is to make the right decision. The second best thing to do is to make a bad decision. The worst thing to do is make no decision. So I've lived my life that way, and I've made a ton of bad decisions, but it never really bothered me because it was like, I can't stop myself from making a decision, because that is a world you just don't want to get into, the world of passivity and being locked up. And so what happened though is, this is what I learned concerning this trap, is that I would make a decision and then I would immediately question whether it was a good decision or a bad decision. And I just didn't know. And so then I would worry more about the decision I made, which increased my anxiety about the situation that I was already in. And it magnified the trap and it started to lock me up. You just start to get into, I don't want to make any decisions. I don't want to do anything. I just want to survive the day. And it was just so odd that I started to get locked up. And the only reason I was able to recognize that this was happening to me is because of the training I took when I was getting my private pilot's license. There was one time when my CFI described it as the error chain. And they were talking about how pilots often, what happens is they make a decision and it's the wrong decision. But it's a decision that if they could reverse real quick, no problem. It's an easy fix. But the problem that a lot of pilots have, especially ones that end up in fatal accidents, is this thing called an error chain. And that is, they make a decision and then they go, oh my gosh, I made the wrong decision, which they immediately jump to the next decision, right? And then that one turns out to be wrong. And then what they end up doing is they make a series of cascading bad decisions, and they immediately find themselves in a situation where they're unable to solve the problem. And they're not calm, they lack confidence. And so this error chain causes fatal accidents. And so my CFI is just basically saying, you've got to learn to make decisions, and you're going to make bad decisions. The question is when you make a bad decision, you got to stop. You got to take a breath, and they have various techniques that they teach you to do that, so that you go, okay, stop. And you tell yourself, okay, it's not fatal yet. Just relax. Go to your checklist. So they try to get you to do what? Think in a certain way, because sometimes it's what you think, right? I'm thinking about this mistake, and then you make another mistake because I'm thinking about what I'm thinking about. And what the pilot training does is try to get you to stop this cascading event of bad decisions by getting you to think about how you're thinking. And that became so insightful for me, because that's why I try to coach people in this all the time. It's sometimes how I think and how I come to decisions that is so critically important, right? And so I started to learn and teach myself that don't make decisions when you're exhausted. And so what I started to do, and this helped me immensely, is realize when I only have a certain amount of sleep in my life, I have a certain few hours of the day when I am clear-headed and I'm alert. And I need to make decisions during that time. The other thing I learned is that I have to try and manage and dispense with and get rid of all of the upheaval in my emotional life, right? Because when you're exhausted, you become more emotionally unstable, whether you want to or not. And so I had to get that out so that I could think clearly. See, it's how you think. I had to think clearly about decisions I needed to make. And then the last thing I learned to do is that once I make a decision, you just have to have confidence and trust in the Lord. I'd have to say, even if it's wrong, the Lord will provide. The Lord will sustain. And so I just thought that it's really important to understand the trap. Now, the second way that you can choose or courage or step forward into courage is by choosing Jesus over understanding. And this is a very difficult thing to do. It's very difficult for type A personalities. I haven't done a lot of work on the Enneagram, but my wife has. And she says, if you're an 8 on the Enneagram, this is really difficult to do. It's for people who are, on Myers-Briggs, they're ISTJs, ESTJs or extrovert. So people that are leaders, people that are go-getters, people that make things happen, people that have a strong sense of conviction or justice, or they're black and white, people that are that way. It says this is really a difficult technique to develop in your life because it's a way of thinking that runs counter to everything else that you've thought and the way you've thought that's brought you success. And so what I call it is choosing Jesus over technique. And that is one of the things that people that have high IQs, I'm not saying I have high IQ, don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying people that are successful in business, people that are great money managers, people that are type A personalities, go-getters. What they do is they learn techniques, right? And one of the techniques they use is I have to understand enough facts to make a good decision. So they learn to value various facts, and they learn over time these facts are irrelevant, these facts are most important, right? And so they learn a hierarchy of facts, and they make judgments quickly about what matters and what doesn't matter in order for them to make good decisions. A lot of people call this wisdom. They call it conviction, knowing your business, knowing your stuff. And that's what that kind of means. And he said, so one of the things that happens when you're in a season of fear and you have that personality type, it's very difficult to choose not to understand what's going on. You have to force yourself, at least I did and still do, that I don't understand this and I may never understand it. And what that does is that gets me out of the old-fashioned why trap. You know the why trap, right? The why trap is, why is this happening? Why, God, are you allowing this? Why, God, can't I understand? Why, God, can't I do better? Why, God, aren't you doing something about it? And what I learned is that when I do that, it might be different for you, but when I do that, what I'm trying to do is put my expectations on how God ought to do his job. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, God, you owe me an explanation because I need to understand. And it just didn't sit right with me when I started to see this clearly, that the way I was thinking about the situation, I was in a why trap. And so I was forcing God to try to help me understand. And it occurred to me is that what if I am incapable of understanding? What if I just don't have the capacity in my brain to understand the immensity of all the probability outcomes for every decision I make in any variable situation? In other words, what I'm saying is that God said in the scriptures, my ways are not your ways. When Job was suffering, he said, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth? Think about that for a second. Even if I wanted to, I may not ever be able to understand why. And so I have to choose Jesus over the why. And this is where courage comes from. This is the connect the dot moment that I want to share with you. And that is this, is that when I choose to give up having to understand, then I can move into a place where courage grows. And you know where courage grows? It grows in trust, right? It's in trust. When I was in college, I got into rappelling, which is kind of a oxymoron when you live in Kansas. There's not a lot of high places in Kansas. And so what we found is a dam that had kind of an extension out for its overflow. And it was this big bridge, and it had about 100-foot drop, which is pretty good. And so we'd tie off there, and then we would rappel off and swing down and do stuff like that. And then we would hike back up. And I remember when I first learned, I had to learn to do two things. Number one, you had to tie your web on. Today, webs are all pre-made. You buy them, you slip them on, like a pair of shorts. But back then, you had to tie your own, and you had to tie it just right, because if you didn't, it was very uncomfortable. But the second thing you had to do is that when you went over the side of the bridge and start hanging out, is you had to fight your fear, because your fear causes you to want to grab a hold and stay as close to the railing as possible. But if you do that, you create an unstable plane. You know the old familiar thing, a three-legged stool creates a stable plane. And so what you have to do is you have to lean back out into the abyss so that you have a stable plane. That means a right foot, a left foot on the side of the railing, and then the rope creates the third leg of a stable plane. And so what's really important is that you have to learn to trust. And the more you learn to trust this new technique of creating a stable plane with your rappelling rope, then the more courage you have. As soon as you get over that initial fear, it was so fun. So you'd rush up and you do it again. And then you'd start swinging and you start doing all of these courageous things that you never imagined you could do. And what was really fascinating is we take a bunch of college kids out there, and one time I was probably a senior, I think, in college then, is that a bunch of sorority girls wanted to go do it. So we took them out there, and they were scared to death at first. But as soon as they pushed into their fear and they learned how to create a stable plane, they started just having the time of their lives. And after they were done, they just kept saying, I think that's the most courageous thing I have ever done. And that's how courage works, is that if I can give up having to understand my situation and the need to understand it and move into trust of Jesus, so choose Jesus over my own understanding, then what happens is I am at a place of peace. And when you're at peace, that's when you can be courageous, even in the face of fear. It's really interesting that G.K. Chesterton has a quote, and I don't think I'm going to get it right here, but basically he says this. He says that a man can stand against when the whole world is against him, when he has his heart. But when his heart fails him, he's finished. And that's where courage comes from, is that who has your heart? And does your heart always stand? And if you have your heart, you can stand against the entire universe. That's why fear and the trap of fear tries to undermine your heart. And sometimes it starts just through physical deprivation of sleep. And then your emotions get out of whack, and then you start questioning all your decisions. And no matter what you do, you can't seem to go forward, and you just get all locked up. Now I want to leave you with just some practical things that you might be able to use. A couple of them are quotes and things like this. And Thucydides, and he was an old Greek philosopher, and he said something really interesting. He said, the secret to happiness is freedom, and the secret to freedom is courage. One of the things I want to do on the Salty Pastor is I want you to learn how to think courageously, right? And in that, you become a more free person. And the more free you become, then the happier you will be, according to Thucydides. And so I think that's really apropos. I believe that the scripture teaches this as well, but even more poignantly. And that is that when we develop courage, because courage, remember, comes from a heart at peace, right? And what stops us from being at peace? Fear, because it creates worry and anxiety. And you remember what Paul said. It says, don't worry, don't be afraid, go to God. Just like Peter stepped out of the boat. Like Jocko said, you got to step into it and go. But what Jocko leaves out, but Peter didn't, is you got to step out of the boat towards Jesus, right? You got to step into your fear towards Jesus. And he says, so take your request to God, it says in Philippians, and the peace of God, not your peace, but the peace of God, which transcends all understanding. Remember I said you have to give up your need to understand. It transcends all understanding, and it guards your heart. It guards your heart. And that guards you from the trap of fear and allows you to think and live courageously, which moves you towards what? Peace. And then that results in happiness. Now, the next one I want to talk about is Winston Churchill, because some people get action. They think courage is just action. And he says something really great. He says this: courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. And this reminds me of James, where he says, be slow to speak and quick to listen. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to teach myself, especially when it comes to God. I need to wait patiently on the Lord so that he will incline to my prayer. He will hear my petition. And when I am still in him, I go in a penitent or humble posture. I come to God and I say to God, I have questions, Lord, but before you answer, before you tell me to do anything, before you guide me, I want you to know my answer will be yes. So you determine to say yes to whatever God asks or tells you before you even ask him to tell you something. And what that does is that opens up your spirit to receive. And that's critical. So courage takes a lot to stand and speak. It also takes a lot to sit down and listen. Well, I hope this series on courage was good for you, because it was certainly good for me. And I hope you're understanding that it's the way you think that makes all the difference. If you would go over to our YouTube channel, like and subscribe, because the more listeners that are subscribing on our YouTube channel, even if you don't listen through the through YouTube, you only listen through the podcast, like a podcast app, that's awesome. But please do that as a favor so that our subscribers can keep growing, because that opens up and unlocks various things that allows us to continue to grow the platform. You can also go to our website, and if you go there and this is a ministry that's helping you, please consider donating a little bit. You can click on the donate button. It goes right to the Salty Pastor Ministry. It's a tax-deductible gift. It goes right into anything we get goes right back into expanding this platform, because our goal is to help people renew their minds, learn new ways to think in order to grow their faith. Salty Pastor signing off, and remember, always think for yourself.